Hello everyone, here is Yelena Filates, the owner of My Blooming Heart Hypnotherapy and Coaching, and expert on anxiety, here back with you to talk about how to handle uncertainty of life with more ease and poise. Because just look around. It is still September, not yet October 2023 when I'm recording this. And there's so much happening. There's climate change that's been happening for years, recession, wars, refugees being displaced, you name it. Everywhere you look on a grand arena of life, there is something going on. And of course, our lives are affected by it too, whether we like it or not. On top of that, we're all dealing with our own personal uncertainties when it comes to our workplace, if you're running your business, how will it do this month, how will it do in the long term, how we're gonna do when we get older, how our kids gonna do. There's so much that we have to handle on a daily basis that no wonder a lot of times we resort to substances or activities that bring us a momentary relief, but they do not provide us with a lasting happiness. And this is a choice that we make every time we have to find a regulation for our nervous system. When we are stressed and we have a craving for something that we used in the past, like for me it was tobacco and cannabis as well, that would give us that a little bit of an escape there, allowed us to avoid the discomfort of the moment, but at the same time will only create more of itself in the long run, create a habit of itself. Or we can reach for activities and practices and methods that allow our nervous system to really find that sweet spot, like mindfulness, the techniques inspired by polyvagal theory, which is the science of befriending one's nervous systems. And there's a bunch more modalities that allow us to drop in with ourselves in a sustainable way. But you already probably know, and now know it too well, that it's so much easier to instead doing all of those practices, like doing a breath inspired meditation or taking a walk. It's much easier to either reach for a cigarette if we have it available, or for a cupcake, or to scroll social media, because those habits die hard. Habits in general die hard, but especially the ones that we developed to handle the discomfort of the moment. And this particular episode of my YouTube videos, I want to dedicate to talking about how habits are formed, why they're so tricky to unwind, why willpower fails, and how we can use mindfulness instead to begin to disenchant our brain, to teach it the actual lack of the value of the habitual behavior or the substance that we are resorting to, so that instead we can replace those habits with new ones, the empowering ones, the ones that will bring us lasting peace, ease, and poise. So stay tuned. And why am I passionate about this? I believe that if you understand how the habits are formed, you can, instead of trying the willpower method or any other ones that are out there, go to the core of it and leverage the very mechanism that creates it. And you also become a little more self-compassionate, because if you understand how habits are formed, and that we're going to get into in just a moment, you will see why it's so hard to undo them, and will hopefully tend to be less hard on yourself when you encounter the cravings again, when you see yourself falling for, so to say, the habitual pattern that you want to quit ultimately. So let's transport really quickly back into the cave time, when the mechanism that creates habits now was very much necessary and good for our evolution. So first of all, the mechanism that I'm talking about that underlies all the habits is called the reward-based learning. Let's see how it appeared at that time. How our cave people were looking for food. They would feel this hunger signal in their body, and they will start looking around, and when they see food, they would eat it, they will feel good, and they will survive. And especially if the food had dopamine and some fat in it, our brain would also release a neurotransmitter dopamine, pairing up the place where the food was found with a memory about it so that we can easily go back to it and find it again. So there is a pattern here that repeats itself in every habit that's made of three components, which is a trigger, behavior, and result. In the case of a caveman, the trigger was that hunger signal. The behavior was to look for food and eat food, and the result was the feeling of satiation, which is pleasant, and also surviving, which is the ultimate reward that we can get in life. So this way our brain remembers, so this is what I should do when I'm hungry. I should eat and I will survive, and I should activate myself to find that food as well, and that would be rewarding in the end. And this is how our brain learns the value of going out there and seeking out food so that we can continue living. And it is a very deeply ingrained mechanism that sits in the emotional part of our brain. And here's a quick section about how our brain is made of two parts. The older part, the more emotional part of the brain that I just mentioned, that hosts such powerful mechanisms as flight and fight, reward-based learning that underlies all of our habits. There is also a younger part of the brain, prefrontal cortex, which evolved 100,000 years past the emotional part of the brain, and that allows us to think through and plan and decide about things and analyze, and it also helps us to survive by thinking. While the emotional part of the brain helps us to survive by developing such mechanisms as reward-based learning, by allowing us to remember where the food is, that we need to actually go and find it, and then we're going to be rewarded, and also by giving us a short but powerful burst of energy when we need to either fleeing away from the danger or engaging with it. And when they work in a synergy of their own between the emotional and the newer part of the brain, the younger part of the brain, they work beautifully well. Our older part of the brain, the emotional one, keeps us alive long enough for our younger brain to kick in and start planning for the future, because this is where the future planning lives. And this is where we also get stuck on uncertainty of life. Our prefrontal cortex doesn't like uncertainty whatsoever, and it wants to do anything to reduce it as much as possible, to analyze it, overthinking, thinking, worry about it. That might feel like we are problem solving, but we're not. All because uncertainty is the main trigger for the prefrontal cortex to come into play and do its job that it normally does well, thinking. That's why human species have done so well surviving so far. But when we come back to the reward-based learning that underlies the habits, keeping in mind that structure of our brain as well, we'll see how the willpower is not a great way to undo those habits from the core. So let me tell you a little more about how habits perpetuated, and then we come back to the brain science and talk about what is it about the willpower that makes us not as useful when it comes to using it as a tool to unwinding habits as mindfulness, for example. So remember the three components of the habit that I just mentioned: trigger, behavior, and reward or result. You can see the same pattern coming up in so many things that we do now. Let's say fast forward to the last night. I love this example. It's from the book Unwinding Anxiety by Dr. Brewer, who I adore. So look it up when you have a moment. I will put it in a caption. So the example goes like this. Fast forward to the last night when you were feeling either lonely or tired, or you name it, a number of things. There was some kind of a discomfort going on. And your brain was like, remember this dopamine thing? You know, that thing that you can do to kind of survive? You know, you can actually use it for more than just survival. You can also use it to make you feel good. And we thank our brain and go to the fridge, because the food is much more easy to combine these days than when the cave people were around. We grab a pint of ice cream that we have there and we eat it, and we feel the bliss temporarily. only to then, not so long after, in most cases anyway, we start to feel regret. And especially if something that we want to quit as a habit, we arrive at the point of remorse and feeling like we should have done it. But a lot of times we skip over that part and we focus on how rewarding it feels. And it is feeling very rewarding physically in the very moment. And our brain is like, feels really good, feels very rewarding, I love it. It's probably conducive to my survival, even if it's not, but it's because it's underlined by the same reward-based learning. Our brain thinks that eating a pint of ice cream somehow is conducive to our rewarding. How about I do it every time when I feel this boredom, loneliness, tiredness, and I know I'll take it away. And our brain quickly learns to repeat to eat ice cream or smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol, you name it, when we, instead of a hunger signal, now we feel an emotional signal of some sorts. So in this way, the reward-based learning underlies all of those cases when we reach habitually for certain substances or activities to either take away some discomfort, like in that case, or to bring the sense of relief, even though if it's temporarily. Like in the case of the habit of worrying, which is a habit as well, it's a mental behavior. It promises different rewards that don't necessarily deliver them, but the most important thing is that our brain get hooked on those promises. So let's see how we get into the worry habit. The trigger for a worry loop, a habit loop of worrying, tends to be uncertainty of some kind. And then the behavior that we're engaging is trying to resolve it, trying to reduce it. We start with problem solving, perhaps mental gymnastics, but we end up in worrying instead, which is not exactly the same as problem solving. It has a lot of the negative emotion coupled with the actual process of thinking that tends to drive us into more fearful state, but at that moment we're not necessarily aware of it, and as a result of that worrying as a behavior, a lot of times we tend to feel a little more in control because we technically, in theory, problem solving, we can feel like we are doing something even there is nothing else to do in this very moment. There is perhaps no way to resolve that uncertainty but to wait until we have more information. But we are really feeling much better when we are doing something. So we are doing something and gives us a bit of that pleasant feeling that we are engaging with the problem in hand. And also sometimes worrying does bring solutions, although a lot of times they are not long lasting, because every time when we come up with a solution or reassurance while we're worrying, the next thing we know, our brain comes up with a new what if question. And if we just answer the previous one, the next thing we know, we are answering yet another what if question. And what if? It's because uncertainty ultimately is not reducible to zero ever. And if we allow our brain to go wild thinking about it, it will just get stuck into that worry loop because of those three: feeling more in control, feeling like we're doing something, and occasionally coming up with a solution here and there. Because of those rewards, our brain gets stuck on the worry habit. And why it's so hard to unwind either the worry habit or eating sweets or smoking tobacco? Because when we try to use the willpower to command ourselves to snap out of it, we're using the tool, the willpower, that is situated in our younger part of the brain, which is much less developed from the evolutionary standpoint than our older brain. And what you're trying to undo and undermine by using the willpower is the mechanism that has evolved to ultimately to propel our survival in the long term. So you're up against something that evolved for 1,100 of years to help our survival by using something that also tends to go offline, our willpower, our prefrontal cortex, when the emotion of stress overpowers it. Just think about how hard it is to command yourself not to do that thing that you want to quit when you are stressed out, when we tend to be drawn to those cravings very intensely. It's very hard to somehow just to squeeze ourselves in our willpower and tell ourselves just don't do it and walk away. It is because we're using, again, the much weaker tool that we have in our toolbox, just by nature how brain has evolved over time. And mindfulness is the mechanism that we actually need to use to teach our brain to see that, wait a minute, this behavior that you're engaging in, remember that was that dopamine hit that you got from eating that cupcake? This is not the end result. The end result is the regret, the remorse, feeling more stress, feeling more anxiety over time. Like that, what worrying does as a habit, it actually increases our anxiety over time. That's something that we tend to skip over a lot because those sensations are not comforting. And understandably so, we don't want to feel discomfort. But there is a way when it comes to mindfulness to engage with the experience of the end result of that behavior that you want to quit, so that we are capable just to stay with the experience of discomfort long enough for our brain to change the reward value for that behavior in its hierarchy. And next time when you're drawn to that behavior or the substance that you ultimately want to quit, your brain can pause for a second and think, wait a minute. Part of me thinks that I will be getting this great, amazing experience, that relief, and it's true, I will, but at the same time, I also know now that ultimately the result of it is going to be not so great. So how about if I take another pause and think about if I actually want to engage in it? And that works for the substances, social media scrolling, shopping, worrying being one of those habits, you name it. That pause will allow you to choose wisely. Either you want to engage in that behavior or you want to choose something lasting to bring regulation to your nervous system, something that also involve mindfulness or breath or the techniques from polyvagal theory. There is a number of things that we can do that we don't get addicted to, that don't require us to go in a store and buy anything, that based upon the internal attitude that can bring us centeredness and the feeling of peace and balance here and now, if we're only willing to let go of those habitual patterns and engage into new ones that are good for us, healthy for us, bring the sense of well-being and freedom over time. So thank you so much for watching. I hope it brought some clarity to the process of how habits are formed and why willpower is not a great tool to try to unwind them, but the mindfulness is. Please look into the caption for the link to the video of mine, where in that caption I included the 10 different techniques of how you can bring your relation to your system right in the moment when anxiety hits, when you're handling that uncertainty. Leave any comments, any questions, and find me on Instagram at my Blooming Heart Hypnotherapy. Thank you so much for watching.